The lawyer's voice droned on about assets and beneficiaries, but I couldn't stop staring at the single rusted key sitting in the center of his mahogany desk. It looked ancient, like something you'd find at an estate sale tucked inside a box of forgotten trinkets. The metal was pitted with age, the bow shaped like a clover, and attached to it was a small paper tag with my late husband's handwriting. 3 words that made my chest tighten with confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to anger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Brennan, the lawyer repeated, pushing the key slightly toward me across the polished surface. Did you hear what I said about the property in Millbrook County? I blinked, pulling my attention away from that mysterious key and back to Gerald Hutchins, the estate attorney who had been handling my husband's affairs since Thomas passed 6 weeks ago. I'm sorry, Gerald. Could you repeat that? My mind has been elsewhere lately. He offered a sympathetic smile, the kind professional's perfect after years of dealing with grieving widows. Of course, Eleanor. I understand this is overwhelming. What I said was that in addition to your home here in the city, your savings accounts, and the investment portfolio, Thomas left you a farm property in Millbrook County. According to these documents, it's been in his family for generations. A farm. Thomas had never mentioned a farm. Not once in our 37 years of marriage. We'd lived our entire adult lives in Richmond, Virginia. Thomas had been an accountant, a man who wore pressed shirts and polished shoes, who preferred climate-controlled offices to dirt and livestock. The idea of him connected to farmland seemed as likely as discovering he'd secretly been an astronaut. I don't understand, I said slowly. Thomas never said anything about a farm. Are you certain this is correct? Gerald consulted his papers, flipping through several pages before nodding. Quite certain. The property is 140 acres, located about 2 hours west of here. There's a house, several outbuildings, and according to the tax records, it's been sitting vacant for approximately 3 decades. He paused, glancing at me over his reading glasses. The property taxes have been paid automatically from a separate account all these years. Your husband never mentioned it? I shook my head, feeling that strange anger beginning to simmer beneath my confusion. 3 decades. We'd been married 37 years, which meant Thomas had owned this farm for most of our marriage and never breathed a word about it. What else had my husband kept from me? Gerald cleared his throat gently. There's also this letter. He handed me a cream-colored envelope, heavier than standard paper, with my name written in Thomas's careful script across the front. It was sealed with red wax, theatrical and unlike anything Thomas would normally do. He left instructions that you were to receive this only after the property details were disclosed. My hands trembled slightly as I took the envelope. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part wanted to throw it in the trash and pretend none of this existed. Thomas and I had built a good life together, or so I'd thought. We'd raised 2 children, celebrated anniversaries, weathered his mother's long illness and my father's sudden death. We'd been partners, companions, best friends. At least, that's what I'd believed until 6 weeks ago, when a massive heart attack took him from me in the produce section of our neighborhood grocery store. And now this. Secret property, mysterious keys, sealed letters. It felt like discovering I'd been married to a stranger. Gerald rose from his chair, giving me space. I'll step out for a moment and let you read that privately. Take all the time you need. After he left, closing the door softly behind him, I sat alone in that quiet office with its leather-bound law books and the faint scent of lemon furniture polish. Outside the window, Richmond's downtown traffic hummed along, people going about their ordinary lives while mine seemed to be unraveling one revelation at a time. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled 2 pages, and I could almost hear his voice as I read. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've just learned about the farm. I can imagine your confusion, possibly your anger. You have every right to both. I should have told you about Meadowbrook Farm years ago, decades ago, but the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became to find the words. The truth is complicated, my love, and I was a coward about it. The farm belonged to my parents. I grew up there until I was 17. Those years were both the happiest and most painful of my life. When I left for college, I swore I'd never go back, and I kept that promise for 30 years. But I couldn't bring myself to sell it either. It held too many memories, too many ghosts, too much of who I was before I became the man you knew. I know this sounds cryptic and unfair. I know you're probably furious with me right now, sitting in Gerald's office wondering what other secrets I kept. The answer is none, Eleanor. This was the only thing I held back, and I held it back not because I didn't trust you but because I was ashamed. Ashamed of my past. Ashamed of the reasons I left. Ashamed that I let so many years pass without resolution. The key Gerald gave you opens the main gate. Inside, you'll find the farmhouse exactly as my parents left it. I paid a caretaker service to maintain the exterior and keep the property from falling into total disrepair, but I instructed them never to enter the house itself. What's inside belongs to my family's history, and now I suppose it belongs to you. Eleanor, I need to ask something of you, even though I have no right to ask anything after keeping this secret. Please go to the farm. Not immediately, not until you're ready, but someday. Go and see it. Walk through the house. Open the drawers and closets. Read what you find there. And then decide what to do with it all. Sell it, burn it, turn it into something new. Whatever you choose, I'll understand. There's something waiting for you in the farmhouse, something I could never face myself, but something I desperately want you to have. You'll know it when you see it. It's in my old bedroom, the one at the end of the upstairs hallway. I'm sorry, my darling. Sorry for the secret. Sorry for the confusion. Sorry that I'm not there to explain this properly or hold your hand through whatever you discover. You deserved better than this mystery. You deserved the whole truth while I was alive to give it to you. But know this absolutely without question or doubt. Every moment of our life together was real. Every laugh, every conversation, every quiet morning with coffee and the newspaper. The man you married, the father of your children, the person who loved you more than anything in this world, that was the truest version of me. Meadowbrook Farm represents who I was before I found you, before I found myself. All my love, always and forever, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times, and with each reading my emotions shifted and transformed. Anger, yes. Hurt at being excluded from such a significant part of his past. But also curiosity, sharp and insistent. What had happened at that farm? What had driven 17-year-old Thomas away so completely that he'd spent 30 years paying to maintain a property he refused to visit? What was waiting in that upstairs bedroom? When Gerald returned, I'd composed myself enough to discuss the practical matters. The property was mine, free and clear. The caretaker service contract could be continued or terminated at my discretion. The farm wasn't generating income, just existing in a kind of suspended animation, waiting. I left his office with a folder of documents, that rusted key heavy in my purse, and a decision already forming in my mind. My daughter Caroline had been pestering me to take a trip, to get away from the house I'd shared with Thomas and all its memory-soaked rooms. My son Marcus wanted me to visit him in Seattle, to let him and his wife fuss over me. Both of them worried I was drowning in grief, and maybe I was, but their solutions felt like running away, and suddenly I had somewhere to run toward instead. That evening I called Caroline first. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with forced cheer. Mom, hi. I was just thinking about you. How are you doing? Really doing, not the polite answer. I'm confused, I told her honestly. And I need to take a trip, but not the kind you've been suggesting. I explained about the farm, the letter, the secret Thomas had kept. Caroline listened without interrupting, which was unlike her. My daughter had inherited her father's analytical mind, but my tendency toward immediate reaction and opinion. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's incredibly strange, Mom. Dad never mentioned anything about growing up on a farm. He always made it sound like he had this totally normal suburban childhood." I know, I replied, staring at Thomas's letter spread out on the kitchen table. That's what I thought too. Are you going to go? Caroline asked. To the farm, I mean. Yes, I said, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. I need to see it. I need to understand. Do you want company? Caroline offered. I could take a few days off work. Drive out there with you. The offer was tempting. Caroline was capable and practical, good in a crisis. But something about this felt intensely personal, like a conversation between Thomas and me that couldn't include anyone else. Not even our children. Not yet. Thank you, sweetheart, but I think I need to do this alone first. Once I know what I'm dealing with, maybe you and Marcus can come see it. If there's anything worth seeing. We talked a while longer, And I could hear the worry in her voice even as she tried to respect my decision. After we hung up, I called Marcus. The conversation followed a similar pattern, though my son's response was more protective. Mom, I don't think you should go to some abandoned farm by yourself. What if something's wrong with the property? What if it's not safe? Then I'll turn around and come home, I assured him. Marcus, I'm 62 years old, not 90. I'm perfectly capable of driving 2 hours and looking at a house. Besides, your father paid people to maintain it. It's not going to collapse on me. But why did he keep it secret? Marcus pressed. That's what I need to find out, I said simply. Over the next 3 days, I prepared for the trip. I arranged for a neighbor to collect my mail and water my plants. I packed a small suitcase with practical clothes, boots, a flashlight, my phone charger.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I printed out directions to Millbrook County even though I had GPS, some old habit making me want paper backup. I felt like I was preparing for an expedition rather than a simple drive into rural Virginia. The night before I planned to leave, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bed I'd shared with Thomas for 37 years, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the man I'd known with this hidden chapter of his life. Thomas had been steady, reliable, almost predictable in the best way. He'd remembered anniversaries and never forgot to kiss me goodbye in the morning. He'd coached Marcus's little league team and taught Caroline to drive with remarkable patience. He'd been present, fully there, in every moment of our shared life. So why had he kept this farm locked away like a shameful secret? What could possibly have happened there that was so terrible he'd exiled himself from it for 3 decades? My imagination conjured dramatic scenarios. Maybe his parents had been cruel. Maybe he'd witnessed something traumatic. Maybe there was a scandal, a crime, something too painful to speak about. Or maybe a quieter voice suggested it was something more ordinary. Grief, perhaps. Loss. The simple pain of a childhood that ended too abruptly. I woke before dawn, gave up on sleep, and was on the road by 6 in the morning. The drive took me west from Richmond, through increasingly rural landscapes. Suburban sprawl gave way to small towns, which gave way to farmland and forest. The October morning was crisp and clear, the trees just beginning their autumn transformation, leaves edged with gold and crimson. I stopped once for coffee and gas in a small town called Harmony. The gas station attendant, a young man with kind eyes, noticed my city license plates. Just passing through? He asked. Not exactly, I said, surprising myself with honesty. I'm going to look at a farm in Millbrook County. My husband left it to me. Meadowbrook Farm? His eyebrows rose. Really? That place has been empty forever. My dad used to talk about the family that lived there. Said they kept to themselves mostly, but they had the best apple orchard in 3 counties. The information felt like a small piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Apples. Thomas had always loved apple pie. Requested it for every birthday. Was that connected? Did you know them? I asked. The family that lived there? The young man shook his head. Nah, that was before my time. But Dad might remember more if you want to stop by. He runs the hardware store on Main Street. Eugene Patterson. I thanked him and continued on my way, tucking that information aside. Maybe after I saw the farm, I'd come back and talk to Eugene. Patterson. Maybe there were people in this area who remembered Thomas, who could fill in the blanks his letter had left empty. The GPS directed me onto progressively smaller roads, from highway to state route to county road to what was barely more than a paved lane winding through dense forest. Then, finally, the mechanical voice announced, "You have arrived at your destination." I pulled over onto the shoulder and stared. A gravel driveway disappeared into the trees, blocked by a rusted metal gate. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and padlock, and even from the road, I could see that the driveway beyond was overgrown with weeds and saplings. Whatever caretaker service Thomas had hired, they clearly hadn't maintained this entrance. I got out of the car, the October air cool against my face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. My hands were shaking slightly as I retrieved the clover-shaped key from my purse. This was it, the moment of no return. Once I opened that gate and drove down that driveway, I couldn't unknow whatever I discovered. Part of me wanted to get back in the car and drive home, to let this secret stay buried with Thomas. But a larger part of me needed answers. I needed to understand the man I'd spent my life with, all of him, not just the version he'd allowed me to see. The key fit the padlock perfectly. It resisted at first, stiff from decades of disuse, but with some effort it turned. The chain clattered to the ground, and I pushed the gate open. It squealed on hinges that desperately needed oil, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. I drove through, then got out and closed the gate behind me. Some instinct made me want to preserve the boundary, to keep the outside world separate from whatever I was about to discover. The driveway was rough, my car bouncing over ruts and rocks hidden beneath the encroaching vegetation. Branches scraped the sides, and more than once I worried I'd get stuck or damage the undercarriage. But I pressed on, driving slowly, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Then the trees opened up and I saw it. Meadowbrook Farm. The house was a 2-story white farmhouse, the paint faded and peeling but the structure solid. A wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides, and several upstairs windows reflected the morning sun. Behind the house I could see a large red barn, its paint in better condition, probably thanks to the caretaker service. There were other outbuildings too, smaller structures I couldn't identify from this distance. And everywhere surrounding it all were apple trees. They lined the driveway, filled an orchard that stretched to the east, dotted the spaces between buildings. Hundreds of apple trees, heavy with fruit. They were untended, unpruned, growing wild but still producing. The ground beneath them was carpeted with fallen apples, filling the air with the sweet, slightly fermenting scent of fruit past its prime. It was beautiful and eerie, this abandoned abundance. Nature reclaiming what humans had left behind but not erasing it. Instead, the trees seemed to be keeping vigil, maintaining their annual cycle regardless of whether anyone was there to harvest the results. I parked in what had once been a gravel parking area near the house and sat for a moment, just taking it in. This was where Thomas had grown up. In this house under these trees, in this quiet corner of Virginia that felt a million miles from the life we'd built together. I tried to picture him here, young Thomas, 17 and full of whatever emotions had driven him away. But the image wouldn't form. The Thomas the first knew didn't fit in this landscape. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car. The porch steps were solid beneath my feet, though the wood had weathered to gray. The front door was locked, but Gerald had given me keys for that too. The lock was newer than the gates, probably installed by the caretaker service, and it turned smoothly. The door swung open, and I stepped into my husband's past. The interior was dim, all the curtains drawn, but enough light filtered through that I could make out the shapes of furniture, the outline of a staircase. The air was musty, thick with decades of stillness, but surprisingly free of the smell of decay or mold. Whatever the caretakers had done to maintain the property, they'd done it well. I found light switches, flipped them, and was surprised when overhead fixtures illuminated. The electricity was still on. Another detail Thomas had arranged, another bill paid automatically from that separate account, keeping this place alive while he stayed away. The house was frozen in time. The living room contained furniture from the late 80s, early 90s, floral patterns and dark wood. The kitchen had appliances from that era, harvest gold and avocado green. A calendar on the wall was turned to October 1994, 30 years ago exactly. That date felt significant, an anniversary of something, though I didn't know what. I walked through the downstairs slowly, opening doors, looking in closets. Everything was neat, orderly, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for the afternoon and would return at any moment. In the living room, photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace. I moved closer, studying them. A wedding photo from the 1960s, a young couple smiling stiffly in formal pose. The man had Thomas's nose, his strong jaw. His parents, I realized. My in-laws, whom I'd never met, never even seen pictures of. Thomas had always said they died when he was young, that he'd been raised by an aunt. Another lie, apparently, or at least another omission. There were other photos. A baby fat and smiling. A toddler on a tricycle. A boy of maybe 7 or 8, gap-toothed and holding a fishing pole. Thomas at different ages, growing up in snapshots. And then the photos stopped. There were no pictures of teenage Thomas, no high school graduation portrait, no prom photos. The chronology simply ended around age 12 or 13. Whatever had happened, whatever had driven him away, it had apparently also driven him out of the family photo gallery. I found myself climbing the stairs, drawn by Thomas's letter. Second floor, end of the hallway, his old bedroom. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the sound echoed through the empty house. The upper hallway was lined with doors, all closed. I walked past them, my hand trailing along the wall, until I reached the last door. It was painted white, same as the others, with a small brass knob. I turned it and stepped inside. Thomas's childhood bedroom was smaller than I'd expected, with sloped ceilings following the roofline. A twin bed was pushed against one wall, covered with a quilt in a pattern of blue and green. A desk sat under the window, and built-in shelves lined another wall, filled with books and trophies and the collected treasures of a boy's life. But what caught my attention, what made my breath catch in my throat, was the far corner. There, carefully arranged on top of a cedar chest, was a collection of items clearly left for me. I crossed the room slowly, feeling like an archaeologist approaching an important discovery. On the chest were several photo albums, their covers worn with handling. Next to them was a shoebox, and on top of that, an envelope with my name on it in Thomas's handwriting, though the paper was yellowed with age. He'd left this years ago, I realized. Maybe decades ago. He'd arranged this display and then trusted that someday, somehow, I'd find it. I sat on the edge of his childhood bed and picked up the envelope first. Inside was a shorter letter, dated March 2010, 14 years ago. Eleanor, it began. If you're reading this, you've come to Meadowbrook Farm. I don't know when, or what prompted your visit, but I'm grateful. What I couldn't tell you in life, I want to show you in these pages. The photo albums contain the full story, the one I was too ashamed to share. I opened the first album with trembling hands. The early pages showed what I'd already seen downstairs, Thomas growing up, happy childhood moments. But as I turned pages, something changed. The smiles became strained. The boy in the photos looked increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly withdrawn. And then, around age 14, another person began appearing in the photos regularly. A girl, probably a year or two older than Thomas, with dark hair and a bright smile. She appeared in family dinners, holiday celebrations, casual snapshots. And the way teenage Thomas looked at her, even in faded photographs from 35 years ago, was unmistakable. This was love, first love, consuming and complete. I turned more pages. Thomas and this girl at what looked like a county fair. Thomas and the girl sitting on the porch steps, his arm around her shoulders. Thomas and the girl in the apple orchard, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Photo after photo, chronicling a relationship that had clearly been central to his teenage life. And then, toward the end of the album, the photos changed again. The girl looked tired, thinner. Thomas looked devastated. And then there was a newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The headline made my heart sink. Local teen dies in accident. I read the brief article with growing horror. Jennifer Hartley, age 17, had died when her car left the road during a rainstorm and struck a tree. She'd been driving home from a friend's house. The accident occurred on October 15, 1994. The same October marked on the calendar downstairs. I sat there on Thomas's childhood bed, holding this album, and suddenly so much made sense. The secret farm, the 30-year absence, the shame he'd mentioned in his letter. Thomas hadn't fled scandal or crime or abuse. He'd fled grief, the overwhelming, impossible grief of losing his first love when he was 17 years old. And somehow in his young mind he'd connected that loss to this place, this farm, these apple trees. There were more albums. I opened them one by one, and they told the rest of the story in images and preserved memories. After Jennifer's death, teenage Thomas had apparently spiraled. Photos showed him looking increasingly gaunt, increasingly lost. There were newspaper clippings about his acceptance to college and escape route. And then a final note in what I recognized as his mother's handwriting. Thomas left for college 3 months after Jennifer passed. He came home for Christmas that first year, but it was too painful. We haven't seen him since. We understand, but we miss him terribly. The date on that note was 1996. 2 years after Jennifer's death. 2 years of hoping their son would come back. I opened the shoebox and inside found letters. Letters from Thomas's mother to him, spanning years. She'd written faithfully, updating him on farm life, telling him about the apple harvest, about neighbors and local news. The letters were gentle, never demanding, always understanding. She never pushed him to visit, Never made him feel guilty, just kept reaching out, keeping the connection alive in the only way he'd allow. The letters ended in 2003. I know why. Thomas had told me his mother died of cancer that year. He'd gone to the funeral, he'd said, but he'd never mentioned where it was or that it meant returning to this farm. His father had died the year before, the letters revealed. Heart attack. Thomas hadn't gone to that funeral, his mother's letters indicated. She'd understood, forgiven him for that too, but the sadness in her words was palpable. I set the box aside and noticed one more item on the cedar chest, small and easily missed. It was a jewelry box, the kind teenage girls keep precious things in. I opened it, and inside was a simple silver bracelet with a small apple charm. A card tucked beside it explained, "This was Jennifer's. Her mother gave it to me after the funeral, said Jennifer would want me to have something of hers. I could never bear to wear it, but I couldn't throw it away either." I sat in that room for hours reading letters, looking through photos, piecing together the tragedy that had shaped Thomas's life before I knew him. He'd been 17 in love, planning a future with Jennifer Hartley. They were going to go to college together, the letters from his mother revealed. They'd both been accepted to Virginia Tech. They were going to get married after graduation. They'd even picked out names for their future children. And then, on a rainy October night, Jennifer had taken a curve too fast. The road had been slick. She'd lost control. And in an instant, teenage Thomas's entire future had shattered. The colleges, the wedding, the children with chosen names, all of it gone. And this farm, these apple trees where they'd spent so much time together, had become unbearable. He'd fled and stayed fled for 30 years. But he'd never sold it. Never let it go. He'd paid to maintain it, preserved his bedroom exactly as he'd left it, kept this shrine to his first love and his lost adolescence. And he'd never told me, his wife of 37 years, about any of it. That's what hurt most, I realized. Not the secret girlfriend. Not the tragic past. But the fact that Thomas had carried this alone, had thought he needed to carry it alone, had believed I wouldn't understand or forgive the fact that Jennifer Hartley had owned his heart first. Sitting there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by evidence of my husband's hidden grief, I felt my anger finally surface fully. How dare he, I thought. How dare he shut me out of this? I was his wife, his partner, the mother of his children. I'd earned the right to his whole story, not just the edited version he deemed acceptable. I'd earned the right to help him carry this pain, to maybe even help him heal from it. But then as quickly as it came, the anger faded. Because I understood. Thomas had been 17, had loved desperately, had lost devastatingly. And in his young, shattered mind, he'd made a decision to wall off that part of himself, to start over completely. By the time he met me 5 years later, that wall had been built so solidly that he didn't know how to dismantle it. And then years passed, decades passed, and the secret had become so much a part of him that revealing it would have meant unraveling his entire constructed identity. He'd been a coward about it, yes, just as his letter said. But he'd also been human, flawed and wounded and doing his best to move forward from an impossible loss. I picked up the bracelet, Jennifer's bracelet, and held it to the light. The apple charm spun slowly, catching the sun. Thomas had kept this for 30 years, this token of his first love. And now he'd left it for me, his second love, his last love. What did that mean? Was it permission? A sharing of something precious? An apology? The sun was setting when I finally left Thomas's bedroom. I'd spent the entire day in that house, reading letters, studying photos, crying more than once. My phone showed missed calls from both Caroline and Marcus, but I'd deal with those later. Right now, I needed to process what I'd learned. I walked outside, down the porch steps, and into the apple orchard. The trees cast long shadows and apples crunched under my feet. The air had cooled, and somewhere a bird was singing its evening song. This place was beautiful, I realized. Sad, yes, heavy with memory and loss, but also beautiful. The farmhouse was solid and well-built. The land was fertile. The apple trees, even neglected, thrived. This wasn't a place of horror or shame. It was simply a place where a young man had experienced the worst loss of his life, and hadn't known how to return. I thought about what Thomas had asked in his letter. To decide what to do with all of it. Sell it, burn it, turn it into something new. The old Eleanor, the Eleanor of 2 months ago who'd never heard of Meadowbrook Farm, might have chosen to sell. Take the money, erase this complication, move on. But standing there in that orchard, holding Jennifer's bracelet in my pocket, I felt something shift inside me. This farm represented Thomas's past, yes. But it also represented possibility. The letters from his mother had mentioned that the orchard had once produced prize-winning apples, that local families had come every fall to pick their own fruit. The farm had been a thriving business before tragedy had turned it into a mausoleum. What if I could restore it? Not as a shrine to the past, but as something new and living. What if I could honor both Jennifer's memory and Thomas's legacy by bringing this place back to life? The idea took root quickly, growing as surely as the apple trees themselves. I could move here at least for a while. I could hire people to help me clean up the property, prune the orchard, renovate the house. I could learn about apples and farming. I could open the orchard to the public again. I could create something good from all this grief. It was crazy. Impractical. I was 62, had lived in cities my whole life, knew nothing about farming or running a business. But it was also exciting in a way I hadn't felt since Thomas died. Maybe since long before Thomas died. 4 years I'd been a wife, a mother, a grandmother. All good things, all chosen things, but still defined by my relationship to others. This could be something that was mine. Project, a purpose, a new chapter. I walked back to the house as darkness fell and called Caroline. When she answered, worried and slightly annoyed, I didn't give her time to lecture me about not answering my phone. Sweetheart, I said, I need to tell you about your father. The real story, the whole story. And then I need your help with something completely insane. Over the next hour, sitting on the farmhouse porch with only the porch light to hold back the darkness, I told my daughter everything. About Jennifer Hartley, about Thomas's grief, about the 30 years of secrets and automatic bank payments and preserved bedrooms. Caroline listened without interrupting, and I could hear her crying softly. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Dad carried that alone all those years? That's so sad, Mom. I wish he'd told us. We could have helped. I know, I agreed. But he couldn't. And now all we can do is decide how to move forward. That's where I need your help. I told her my idea about restoring the farm, opening the orchard. I expected her to try to talk me out of it, to point out all the logical reasons why it was impossible. Instead, she surprised me. I think it's perfect, she said firmly. Dad would love knowing that you turned his place of grief into something positive. Plus, you need a project, Mom. You've been lost since he died. This gives you purpose. We talked logistics. Caroline would come the following weekend to see the property for herself. She'd bring her husband David, who was handy with repairs. Marcus and his wife would visit the weekend after. We'd have a family work weekend, start assessing what needed to be done. Caroline would help me research orchard management, find local contractors, figure out the business side. It felt real suddenly, possible instead of just a grief-fueled impulse. After we hung up, I sat on that porch for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the countryside. Crickets, an owl, the wind moving through apple trees. The farm felt different now, less haunted, more welcoming. I understood what Thomas had been running from, but I also saw what he'd left behind. Not just pain but also beauty. Not just loss but also legacy. I spent that night in the farmhouse, sleeping in what had been the guest room. It felt important to stay, to not run back to the city like Thomas had all those years ago. In the morning I'd start making plans, taking action. But that night, I simply rested in the quiet of the place that had shaped my husband's life in ways I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, I drove into town and found Eugene Patterson's hardware store on Main Street. The owner was a man in his 70s with weather-worn features and kind eyes. When I explained who I was and mentioned Meadowbrook Farm, his face lit up. You're Tom Brennan's wife? I never thought I'd see someone from that farm again. You knew Thomas? I asked, hungry for any information. Eugene nodded. We went to school together through junior year. Tom was a good kid, quiet but friendly enough. Then after Jennifer Hartley died, he changed. Got real withdrawn, stopped coming to school events, barely talked to anyone. He paused, studying me. I heard he left for college and never came back. That's true, I confirmed. He passed away recently, and I'm just learning about his history here. Eugene's expression softened with sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. Tom was a good man, I'm sure, even if he carried heavy grief. He helped me then, spending 2 hours telling me stories about teenage Thomas and Jennifer, about the farm in its heyday, about the community that had once rallied around the Brennan family after the tragedy. Other customers came in and each of them, learning who I was, added their own memories and offered help if I needed it. By the time I left, I had a list of local contractors, recommendations for orchard specialists, and half a dozen offers from townspeople who wanted to help restore Meadowbrook Farm. The following months passed in a blur of activity. True to her word, Caroline came that first weekend with David. Marcus and his wife Rebecca arrived the weekend after. We spent those weekends clearing overgrowth, assessing the house's condition, mapping out the orchard. The farmhouse needed work but was structurally sound. The barn needed a new roof. The orchard needed serious pruning and care but was salvageable. We hired contractors, consulted with agricultural extension agents, developed a business plan. I formally moved from Richmond to Meadowbrook Farm in January, 5 months after Thomas's death and 3 months after I'd first opened that rusted gate. The house gradually transformed. We painted walls, refinished floors, updated the kitchen and bathrooms while keeping the farmhouse's essential character. Thomas's bedroom I left mostly untouched, but I moved the cedar chest with its precious contents to the master bedroom. Jennifer's photo albums and the letters from Thomas's mother earned a place of honor on the bookshelf beside photos of my own children. I didn't see it as betraying Thomas's memory. Instead, I saw it as integrating the truth of his whole life, acknowledging that he'd loved before me, and that love had shaped him just as much as our marriage had. In March, I hosted a small gathering at the farm. Caroline and Marcus came with their families. I'd also invited Jennifer Hartley's mother, whom I'd tracked down through town records. Mrs. Hartley was 78, frail but sharp-minded. She arrived carrying a photo album of her own. We sat together in the living room, and she told me stories about Jennifer, about her daughter's plans and dreams and the bright future that had been stolen. She cried when I showed her the bracelet, the one Jennifer had worn, that Thomas had kept all these years. I gave it back to her, though she initially protested. "It belongs with you," I said. "But if you'd like, we could create something here at the farm in Jennifer's memory." Mrs. Hartley's eyes filled with tears. "Jennifer loved this orchard," she said. "She and Tom spent so much time here." She'd already decided on her wedding flowers, apple blossoms. She wanted everything to be in May when the trees bloomed. We decided together to plant a memorial garden in Jennifer's honor, a quiet corner of the property with a bench and a plaque. It would be a place where people could sit and remember, where the story of young love and tragic loss would be acknowledged rather than hidden. Mrs. Hartley donated several of Jennifer's belongings to be preserved in a small display case, alongside items from Thomas's teenage years. It became a testament to the fact that grief, while private, doesn't have to be solitary. That memory, when shared, can heal rather than harm. By May, we were ready for a soft opening of the orchard. We advertised locally, invited the townspeople who'd been so helpful, and held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I stood on the farmhouse porch with my children beside me, and I spoke about Thomas, about the farm's history, about the dream of restoration and renewal. I mentioned Jennifer too, acknowledging her place in the farm's story without making it maudlin or sensational. Just simple truth. Two young people had loved each other here. They'd planned a future under these apple trees. Tragedy had struck, as it sometimes does, and that tragedy had sent ripples through the decades. But now, finally, the farm was coming back to life. Not as a memorial to the past, but as a celebration of growth and possibility. That first season was modest. We offered pick-your-own apples, sold fresh cider made from our fruit, hosted school field trips to teach children about agriculture. The orchard didn't make a huge profit, but it broke even, and more importantly, it gave me purpose. I learned about pruning techniques and pest management. I hired 2 local teenagers to help with harvest. I made friends with neighboring farmers who generously shared their knowledge. I woke up early each morning and walked through the orchard, checking on the trees, and in those quiet dawn moments I talked to Thomas. I told him about the progress, about the visitors who loved the farm, about how his children were healing by helping restore his childhood home. Caroline visited regularly, often bringing her kids for weekends. My grandchildren climbed the apple trees Thomas had climbed, played in the barn he'd played in, and unknowingly healed wounds they'd never known existed. Marcus came less frequently, his job keeping him busy in Seattle, but when he did visit, I could see him trying to understand his father better through the lens of this place. One evening in late September, as the second harvest season was winding down, I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the orchard in shades of gold and amber. Jennifer's memorial garden was visible from here, the flowers we'd planted blooming cheerfully. The farmhouse glowed with warm light, no longer empty and preserved but lived in and loved. I thought about Thomas's letter, his request that I come here and see and decide what to do. I hoped wherever he was he could see what I'd chosen. I'd chosen to honor both his loves, the woman who'd had his heart first and the life we'd built together. I'd chosen to transform his place of grief into something vibrant and growing. I'd chosen to forgive him for his secrets, understanding that he'd done the best he could with unbearable pain. And I'd chosen to write a new chapter, not just for the farm but for myself. At 63, I'd become a farmer, an orchard keeper, a small business owner. I'd become someone who could look at tragedy and see possibility, someone who could take hidden pain and bring it into the light. The farm had taught me something essential in that first year, that we're all haunted by the past, carrying griefs and secrets and memories we think we have to hold alone. But when we finally open those gates, when we finally let others into the locked spaces of our hearts, we discover something surprising. The ghosts aren't as frightening as we feared. The secrets aren't as shameful. And the burden, when shared, becomes lighter. Thomas had spent 30 years keeping this place locked away. In doing so, he'd locked away part of himself too. I understood why he'd done it, the desperate logic of a 17-year-old heart trying to survive devastating loss. But I was grateful he'd finally, even posthumously, let me in. Grateful for the letter, the key, the carefully preserved evidence of his first chapter. As I sat there in the gathering darkness, I fingered the simple necklace I now wore daily. It contained a small locket with 2 photos. On one side, my wedding photo with Thomas, both of us young and hopeful and ready to build a life together. On the other side, a photo I'd had made from one of the albums, showing teenage Thomas and Jennifer Hartley in the apple orchard, laughing at something beyond the frame. Both loves, both lives, both chapters of the story that had led to this moment. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline, asking about my plans for Thanksgiving. The whole family wanted to gather at the farm this year, to celebrate in this place that had become so meaningful to all of us. I smiled and typed back my agreement. Yes, I wrote, come to the farm. We'll make new memories under the apple trees. And that, I realized, was the true secret Thomas had left for me at Meadowbrook Farm. Not the tragic story of Jennifer Hartley, though that was part of it. Not even the property itself, valuable as it was. The real secret, the real gift, was the lesson that it's never too late to start again. That grief, acknowledged and shared, can be transformed into something beautiful. That the past, no matter how painful, can inform the future without defining it. That love in all its forms across all its seasons is worth honoring. I rose from the porch swing and walked out into the orchard one more time before bed. The apple trees rustled in the evening breeze, their branches heavy with fruit. Tomorrow I'd harvest more apples, press more cider, welcome more visitors to this place that was equal parts history and hope. But tonight, I simply stood among the trees and whispered thanks. Thanks to Thomas for trusting me with his truth. Thanks to Jennifer for the love she'd given a young man who'd carried it his whole life. Thanks to this land for holding all those memories and still producing, still growing, still reaching toward the light. I'd come here looking for answers, driven by confusion and hurt. I'd found something better, a purpose, a peace, and a profound understanding that every life contains multiple stories. We're not required to share them all while we're living. But when we finally do, in whatever way we can, we give the people who love us a precious gift. The gift of our whole selves, complete and complicated and beautifully, perfectly human. The winter months brought a different kind of challenge to Meadowbrook Farm. Snow covered the apple trees, transforming the orchard into a landscape of white silence. The farmhouse, which had felt so alive during harvest season, now settled into a quieter rhythm. I found myself with time to think, to read through more of the letters I'd discovered, to truly understand the man I'd married and the boy he'd been before we met. January arrived with ice storms that kept me indoors for days at a time. I used those hours to organize the farm's business records, plan for the spring planting season, and continue my education about orchard management. But I also spent time in Thomas's old bedroom, sitting in the chair by the window, reading through his mother's letters in chronological order. Each one revealed another layer of a family trying to hold together after unimaginable loss. One letter in particular, dated December 1995, caught my attention. Martha Brennan, Thomas's mother, had written about the first Christmas after he'd left for college and chosen not to come home. "Your father and I set your place at the table anyway," she'd written. "We said grace and included you in our thanks, even though your chair stayed empty. The orchard looks beautiful covered in snow. I walked through it this morning and remembered when you and Jennifer would build snowmen between the rows. She always insisted on using apple slices for the eyes. Do you remember that, Thomas? I hope you're finding some peace wherever you are. We love you and we'll keep the light on." Reading those words, I felt a fresh wave of sadness for Martha and her husband James. They'd lost their son's first love to tragedy, and then they'd effectively lost their son to grief. Yet Martha's letters never contained anger or resentment, only love and understanding and an endless patience that took my breath away. She'd been a remarkable woman, and Thomas had inherited her capacity for quiet strength, even if he'd struggled with her gift for forgiveness. By February, I'd made a decision that felt both natural and necessary. I contacted a local carpenter and commissioned a special project. Using wood from an old apple tree that had finally died and needed to be removed, I asked him to create a wooden bench with an inscription. The bench would sit in Jennifer's memorial garden, and the words carved into the backrest would read, "For Jennifer and Thomas who loved here. For Martha and James who understood. For all of us learning to carry grief with grace." When the bench was delivered in early March, I invited Mrs. Hartley to come see it. She arrived on a crisp morning when the first hints of spring were beginning to show, tiny buds forming on the apple trees. We walked together to the memorial garden, and when she saw the bench, she placed her hand over her mouth and cried. But they were good tears, healing tears. We sat together on that bench, two women who'd lost people they loved, and talked about memory and forgiveness and the strange paths life takes us down. Mrs. Hartley told me something that day that shifted my understanding even further. She said that Jennifer had known she was sick. Not sick with something that would cause a car accident, but sick in a way that teenage Jennifer had kept secret from everyone except Mrs. Hartley. Jennifer had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition 6 months before the accident. The doctors had said she might live 10 years, maybe 20 if she was lucky, but that her time would almost certainly be cut short. Jennifer had begged her mother not to tell anyone, especially not Thomas. She'd wanted to live normally, to love fully, to experience everything she could in whatever time she had. When the accident happened, Mrs. Hartley had been devastated but also, in some terrible way, relieved. At least Jennifer had died living, not wasting away in a hospital bed, not watching Thomas watch her decline. At least her last moments had been ordinary, driving home on a rainy night, probably thinking about college plans and wedding flowers and all the dreams young people dream. I asked Mrs. Hartley if Thomas had ever known about Jennifer's heart condition. She shook her head firmly. No one knew except Jennifer, myself, and her cardiologist. Jennifer made me swear never to tell, and I kept that promise even after she died. I thought it would only make Thomas's grief worse, knowing that he was going to lose her one way or another. At least the accident was sudden, quick. She didn't suffer. This information reframed everything I understood about Thomas's choices. He'd fled not just the pain of losing Jennifer, but also the apparent randomness of it. The senseless tragedy of a rainy road and a moment's loss of control. If he'd known about her heart condition, would it have made a difference? Would he have understood that their time together had been precious precisely because it was limited? Or would it have added another layer of anguish, the knowledge that fate had been conspiring against them from the start? I decided not to share this information with my children. It felt like Mrs. Hartley's secret to keep or tell, not mine. But it did help me understand Thomas more fully. He'd built his life with me on the foundation of that teenage loss, and he'd built it carefully, deliberately, trying to create something stable and lasting. Our marriage had been his answer to the chaos and unpredictability that had stolen Jennifer. We'd been steady, reliable, predictable in the best possible way. Not boring but safe. And maybe that's exactly what he'd needed. March brought the first real signs of spring, and with it, the arrival of my children for what Caroline had dubbed the Spring Planning Summit. Both families descended on the farm for a long weekend, armed with laptops and spreadsheets and ambitious ideas for expanding the orchard business. We gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Thomas had eaten meals as a boy, and discussed everything from marketing strategies to crop diversification to the possibility of adding a farm stand. Marcus surprised me by suggesting we consider hosting events at the farm. Weddings, he said, looking around the property with an entrepreneur's eye. The orchard would be beautiful for outdoor ceremonies, especially in May when the trees bloom. We could renovate the barn for receptions. There's definitely a market for rustic farm weddings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Thomas and Jennifer had planned to marry here, had chosen apple blossoms for the ceremony. Now Marcus was proposing we turn that unfulfilled dream into a business opportunity. But instead of feeling morbid, it felt appropriate. What better way to honor young love than to provide a space where other couples could celebrate theirs? Caroline jumped on the idea immediately, already researching local wedding venues and their pricing. We'd need significant investment to make the barn suitable, she noted. New flooring, proper lighting, bathrooms, maybe a catering kitchen. But if we did it right, it could be the primary revenue stream, especially during non-harvest months. We spent that weekend walking the property, measuring spaces, taking photos, dreaming big. David, Caroline's husband, proved invaluable with his construction knowledge. He could envision what spaces could become, see potential where I saw only old buildings and overgrown paths. By Sunday evening, we had a rough business plan and a timeline that stretched over the next 2 years. Phase 1 would focus on improving the orchard and expanding the pick-your-own operation. Phase 2 would tackle the barn renovation. Phase 3, if all went well, would add guest accommodations, maybe converting one of the smaller outbuildings into a charming cottage for wedding parties or visitors. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for a woman in her 60s with no farming experience. But I'd learned something important in the months since discovering the farm. Age wasn't the limitation I'd been taught to believe it was. I had energy, resources, motivation, and family support. I had a purpose that got me out of bed excited each morning. And I had Thomas's legacy, not just the physical property but also his example of resilience, of rebuilding after devastation. As my children packed to leave that Sunday afternoon, Caroline pulled me aside. "Mom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. I wasn't sure about this whole farm project at first. I thought maybe you were just running from grief, finding a distraction that would fade once the novelty wore off. But watching you this weekend, seeing how you talk about the orchard and the plans, I realize I was wrong. You found something real here. Something that matters." Her words meant more than she probably knew. I'd worried that my children saw this as a phase, an old woman's grief-fueled fantasy that they were indulging until I came to my senses. Knowing that Caroline understood, that she saw the genuine transformation happening, gave me confidence to push forward, even when the challenges seemed overwhelming. April brought those challenges in abundance. The spring weather was unpredictable, swinging between warm sunshine and late frosts that threatened the budding apple blossoms. I learned to monitor weather forecasts obsessively, to understand the difference between a freeze warning and a frost advisory, to know when to run sprinklers in the orchard overnight to protect the delicate blooms. I made mistakes, lost some trees to my inexperience, and learned hard lessons about the unforgiving nature of agriculture. But I also experienced moments of transcendent beauty. The morning the orchard burst into full bloom, I stood among the trees and wept. Thousands of apple blossoms, each one a small miracle of pink and white, transforming the farm into something from a fairy tale. The air smelled sweet, bees hummed busily among the flowers, and I understood viscerally why Jennifer had wanted apple blossoms for her wedding. There was something hopeful about them, something that spoke of potential and promise, and the faith that flowers would become fruit. I took hundreds of photos that morning and sent them to my children, to Mrs. Hartley, to the friends I'd made in town. I also did something more private. I printed one of the best photos and placed it in Thomas's old bedroom, in a frame next to the photos of him and Jennifer. It felt like closing a circle, showing him that the orchard he'd fled was still beautiful, still blooming, still full of life despite decades of neglect and sorrow. May arrived, and with it came the first anniversary of Thomas's death. I'd been dreading this milestone, worried that it would drag me back into the acute grief of those early weeks. Instead, I found myself hosting a small gathering at the farm. I invited Mrs. Hartley, Eugene Patterson, and several other townspeople who'd known Thomas as a boy, my children and their families, and a few of the new friends I'd made since moving to Millbrook County. We met in Jennifer's memorial garden on a perfect spring afternoon. I'd prepared a simple speech, but when the moment came, words felt inadequate. Instead, I simply said, "We're here to remember Thomas Brennan and Jennifer Hartley, two people whose lives were shaped by love and loss. This farm represents both. It was a place of joy, then a place of grief, then a place of absence. Now we're working to make it a place of life again. That's not forgetting the past. It's honoring it by choosing growth." People shared stories then, memories of Thomas and Jennifer that I'd never heard. Eugene talked about Thomas's quiet kindness in school, how he'd helped younger students with math homework without being asked. A woman named Dorothy, who'd been Jennifer's neighbor, described how Jennifer had volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, how she'd had a gift with frightened dogs, could calm them with just her presence and gentle voice. These small details, these glimpses of who they'd been beyond the tragedy, felt precious. Mrs. Hartley spoke last, her voice thin but steady. "My Jennifer loved this farm," she said. "She loved the orchard, loved spending time here with Tom. If she could see what Eleanor is doing, bringing this place back to life, hosting gatherings like this, she'd be so happy." Jennifer believed in joy. Even knowing her time might be short, she chose joy every single day. I think that's the lesson both of them left us. Choose joy even when it's hard. Choose growth even when it hurts. Choose to keep going, keep loving, keep hoping. After everyone left that evening, I sat alone in the memorial garden as the sun set. I thought about Thomas's last moments, collapsing in that grocery store with a cart full of ordinary purchases, gone before the paramedics arrived. Had he thought of Jennifer in those final seconds? Had he thought of me, of our children, of this farm he'd kept secret? I'd never know, and I'd made peace with that uncertainty. What I did know was that he'd left me something valuable, even if he'd done it imperfectly. He'd left me a mystery that led to understanding, a property that led to purpose, and a story that led to connection. The summer season began with a soft opening of the expanded orchard operation. We'd added more varieties of apples, planted some peach and pear trees in a section of the property that had been empty, and created walking trails through the orchard with educational signs about apple cultivation and local ecology. I hired 3 local teenagers to help with the operation, including Eugene Patterson's granddaughter Maya, a bright high school senior interested in agricultural science. Maya proved to be a godsend. She was organized, responsible, and genuinely enthusiastic about the farm. She created social media accounts for the orchard, started posting photos and updates, and within weeks had built a following that brought visitors from neighboring counties. Young families came to walk the trails and pick fruit. School groups arrived for educational tours. Local restaurants started contacting us about purchasing our apples for their menus. The farm was becoming known, developing a reputation as a special place. And the story, Thomas and Jennifer's story, became part of that reputation. I didn't hide it or sensationalize it. When people asked about the memorial garden or noticed the bench with its inscription, I told them simply and honestly. 2 young people had loved each other here. Tragedy separated them. The farm held their memory. Now it was growing again. People responded to that truth with surprising depth. I received letters from visitors who'd experienced their own losses, who found comfort in the idea that places of grief could be transformed into places of beauty. One letter particularly moved me. A woman wrote that she'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier, and had been unable to visit any of the places they'd loved together, because the memories were too painful. After visiting Meadowbrook Farm and hearing about Thomas and Jennifer, she'd found the courage to return to her late husband's favorite hiking trail. She'd scattered some of his ashes there and felt, for the first time since his death, that she could remember him without being consumed by sorrow. "Your farm showed me that we can honor the past without being trapped by it," she wrote. "Thank you for your courage in sharing your story." I kept that letter in Thomas's old bedroom, adding it to the collection of memories and mementos that told the fuller story of his life. By August, the barn renovation project was underway. David had taken a leave from his job to oversee the construction, and he approached it with meticulous care. We weren't just slapping up some decorations and calling it a venue. We were restoring the structure properly, preserving its historical character while adding necessary modern amenities. The work was expensive and time-consuming, but watching the barn transform was deeply satisfying. Caroline came to stay for a week in late August, helping me interview potential wedding coordinators and catering companies. One evening, as we sat on the farmhouse porch reviewing contracts, she said something that surprised me. "Mom, I've been thinking about making a change. My job in Richmond is fine, but it's not fulfilling anymore. David and I have been talking, and we're considering moving closer to here. Maybe within 30 minutes or so. That way I could be more involved with the farm, help you with the business side, and our kids could grow up with more connection to this place." The offer was generous and tempting, but I needed to be sure of her motivations. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "I don't want you uprooting your life because you think I need caretaking. I'm managing just fine." She laughed. "Mom, I know you're managing fine. That's not what this is about. This is about me wanting to be part of something meaningful. My corporate job pays well, but at the end of the day, I'm just making rich people richer. Here we're building something real. We're creating beauty and preserving memory and bringing people together. That matters to me." Plus, she added with a grin, "Someone needs to make sure you don't accidentally agree to host a wedding on the same day as the apple harvest." We laughed together, and I felt a surge of gratitude for this daughter who understood what I was trying to create. Over the following weeks, Caroline and David began seriously exploring the possibility of relocating. They found a house they loved in a small town 20 minutes from the farm. Caroline negotiated a remote work arrangement with her company that would allow her to transition gradually. By October, a year after I'd first opened that rusted gate, my daughter and her family had become my neighbors. Marcus couldn't make the same commitment, his career and life firmly established in Seattle, but he visited more frequently and stayed engaged with the farm's progress through regular video calls. He'd taken charge of the financial planning, helping me understand profit margins and tax implications and long-term sustainability. My son, the software engineer, had discovered a knack for agricultural business management, and his analytical mind proved invaluable as we navigated the complexities of running a small farm operation. The second harvest season was significantly more successful than the first. We'd learned from our mistakes, improved our processes, and benefited from Maya's social media marketing. Visitors came from across Virginia and even neighboring states, drawn by the combination of quality fruit, beautiful setting, and the touching story behind the orchard's restoration. The memorial garden became an unexpected draw, a place where people lingered, reflected, and often left small tokens of their own grief and remembrance. I started finding items there regularly, photographs tucked into the branches of nearby shrubs, usually with short notes explaining who the person in the photo was. Flowers left on the bench with names written on attached cards. Once I found a wedding ring on a ribbon with a note that read, "He died before we could marry, but I still feel married to him in my heart. Your farm helps me remember that love doesn't end, it just changes form." These offerings, these small acts of shared grief and remembrance, transformed the memorial garden into something larger than I'd initially imagined. It became a community space for mourning and healing, a place where people who'd experienced loss could feel less alone. I started keeping a journal in a weatherproof box near the bench, inviting visitors to write their own stories if they wanted. The pages filled quickly with names and dates and heartfelt expressions of love and loss. November brought the first wedding at Meadowbrook Farm. The couple, both teachers in their 40s, had found each other after previous marriages had ended. They wanted a small, intimate ceremony that reflected new beginnings rather than traditional fanfare. The barn looked stunning, transformed by David's skilled work and Caroline's design eye into a space that felt both rustic and elegant. The ceremony took place in the orchard on a crisp autumn afternoon, with apple trees as witnesses and a small group of friends and family as guests. I watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude on their special day, but feeling deeply moved by the sight. This orchard that had been meant to host Thomas and Jennifer's wedding 40 years earlier was finally fulfilling that purpose, just with different people and a different story. After the ceremony, the groom sought me out. He thanked me for creating such a special place and then said something that made my eyes well up. My late wife, my first wife, loved apples. She made the best apple pie I've ever tasted. Being here, getting married under these trees, it feels like she's giving us her blessing. Like the past and present can coexist peacefully. That's exactly right, I told him. That's exactly what this place is about. The wedding season we'd planned for was still months away, but this first ceremony felt like a blessing, a confirmation that we were on the right path. As December arrived and the farm settled into winter dormancy again, I found myself reflecting on the transformative year I'd experienced. I'd gone from a grieving widow adrift in confusion and hurt to a woman with purpose, community, and a future I was actively building. On Christmas Eve, both my children and their families gathered at the farmhouse. We decorated a tree in the living room, the same room where Thomas had grown up celebrating holidays. We cooked together in the kitchen where his mother had made meals. We bundled up and walked through the snowy orchard, and I told my grandchildren stories about their grandfather as a boy, stories I'd pieced together from letters and photos and conversations with townspeople who remembered. My youngest granddaughter, who was 6, asked me if Grandpa's friend Jennifer was an angel now. I thought about how to answer that, aware of both children listening and waiting. I don't know about angels, I said honestly, but I do know that people we love stay with us in our memories and in our hearts. Jennifer lives on in the stories people tell about her kindness, and in this beautiful orchard that she loved. That's a kind of forever, isn't it? She seemed satisfied with that answer, and we continued our walk. When we returned to the warm house, Caroline had hot chocolate waiting, and we spent the evening playing games and sharing memories. It felt complete somehow, this blending of past and present, of grief acknowledged and joy embraced, of Thomas's history and our family's future. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the snow-covered orchard. The memorial garden was barely visible in the darkness, just a lighter patch among the trees. I thought about Thomas and the secret he'd kept, about Jennifer and the secret she'd kept, about all the things we hide from the people we love, sometimes to protect them and sometimes to protect ourselves. I thought about Martha Brennan and her patient letters, about Mrs. Hartley and her impossible promise to keep her daughter's diagnosis secret, about all the ways love can hurt and heal simultaneously. And I felt grateful. Grateful for the mystery that had led me here. Grateful for the year of transformation. Grateful for the opportunity to turn hidden pain into shared beauty. Thomas had asked me to decide what to do with the farm. To sell it, burn it, or turn it into something new. I'd chosen the third option, but in doing so, I'd also done all three in a way. I'd sold my old life, the one where I'd been only a wife and mother. I'd burned away my assumptions about who Thomas had been and who I needed to be. And I'd created something entirely new, something that honored the past while reaching boldly toward the future. The farm had one more gift for me that winter, though I didn't discover it until January. While cleaning out the attic to convert it into additional storage space, I found a box I'd somehow missed during my initial explorations. Inside were journals, dozens of them, dating from Thomas's childhood through his first year of college. I almost didn't read them, worried they would contain pain too private to witness. But curiosity won, and I began with the earliest entries. Young Thomas's voice came through clearly in those pages. He wrote about school and friends and farm chores with the matter-of-fact tone of a boy for whom journal writing was an assigned task rather than emotional outlet. But around age 14 the entries changed. He started writing about Jennifer, his observations shyly admiring at first, then openly adoring as their relationship developed. He wrote about wanting to kiss her but being too nervous. He wrote about their first date, a movie in the next town over that he barely watched because he was too aware of her sitting beside him. He wrote about planning their future with the certainty of young love that believes it's invincible. The entries were sweet and earnest and occasionally embarrassing in the way teenage writing often is. But they were also beautiful, a record of first love in all its intensity and innocence. Then came the entries after Jennifer's death, and those were almost unbearable to read. Thomas's grief poured out in raw, unfiltered expressions of pain. He blamed himself for not driving her home that night. He raged against the randomness of the accident. He described physical symptoms of grief, the way his chest hurt constantly, the way food tasted like ash, the way he couldn't sleep without dreaming of her. The entries became sporadic, separated by days and then weeks. When he wrote, it was often just a few lines. Today I wanted to die. Today I got through. Today I decided to leave. The final entry in that journal was dated 3 days before he left for college. I'm leaving Meadowbrook today, he'd written. I don't know if I'll ever come back. Everyone says time heals, but I don't want to heal. Healing feels like forgetting, and I can't forget Jennifer. So I'm taking the pain with me. It's all I have left of her. Reading those words broke my heart. Thomas at 17, choosing pain over healing because he thought that was loyalty. Carrying that burden for 30 years, never understanding that you could remember someone and still move forward. That love doesn't require suffering to prove its validity. The college journals were fewer, and the entries shorter. Thomas wrote about classes and roommates with detachment, like he was reporting on someone else's life. There was only one entry about meeting me, dated spring of our first year together. I met a woman named Eleanor today. She has kind eyes and doesn't ask too many questions. I think I could be happy with her. Maybe. The simplicity of it stung. I'd remembered our meeting as romantic, a moment of connection and instant chemistry. For Thomas, it had apparently been more calculated, a conscious decision to try for happiness with someone who wouldn't demand too much emotional access. But as I read further, I found entries that soothed that sting. His writing about our developing relationship grew warmer, more genuine. He described our conversations, our dates, the way I made him laugh. He wrote about introducing me to his aunt, the only family he'd maintained contact with, and her approval. He wrote about proposing, and his entry that night was full of hope and determination. I asked Eleanor to marry me tonight, and she said yes. I promised to be a good husband to her. I promised to build a life with her that honors what I learned from losing Jennifer. That loving someone is a gift, and I won't take it for granted. And he hadn't. Whatever secrets Thomas had kept about his past, he'd been an excellent husband in the present. Attentive, affectionate, reliable, devoted. He'd kept his promise to not take our love for granted. Reading those journals helped me understand that his silence about Jennifer and the farm hadn't been about shame or mistrust. It had been about compartmentalization, a young man's survival strategy that had hardened into a lifetime pattern. He'd locked away the pain so completely that he'd forgotten there might be another way to carry it. I spent weeks reading through all the journals, and when I finished, I added them to the collection in Thomas's bedroom. They were part of the story now, part of the full picture of who he'd been. And I felt finally that I truly knew my husband. Not just the version of him I'd lived with, but the complete person he'd been, shaped by joy and tragedy, by first love and second chances, by the farm he'd fled and the life he'd built. By spring, Meadowbrook Farm was thriving. The orchard was in full bloom again. The barn was hosting its first full season of weddings, and the farm stand we'd opened was doing steady business with local customers. Maya, who just graduated high school, had decided to defer college for a year to work at the farm full-time and develop our marketing strategy. Caroline had officially relocated and taken over the business management, her corporate skills translating surprisingly well to agricultural enterprise. Even Marcus had become more involved, building a website and online ordering system that allowed us to ship our products to customers across the country. The farm that Thomas had abandoned 30 years ago, that had sat empty and grieving for 3 decades, was now alive with activity and purpose. And I, the widow who discovered its existence by accident, had become the unlikely steward of its resurrection. Standing in the orchard on a warm May morning, watching bees work the apple blossoms while wedding guests gathered in the distance for another ceremony, I felt complete. Not because the grief was gone, grief doesn't work that way, but because I'd found a way to carry it that didn't require hiding or running or pretending. I'd found a way to honor both the love I'd had with Thomas and the love he'd had before me. I'd found a way to take a place of sorrow and transform it into a place of celebration. And I'd found myself in the process, not the woman I'd been as Thomas's wife, but the woman I was becoming in his absence. The gate I'd opened with that rusted key hadn't just led to a property. It had led to understanding, to purpose, to a second act I'd never imagined for myself. And standing there in the orchard with apple blossoms drifting down like snow, I sent a silent thank you to Thomas for the secret he'd kept and finally shared, for the mystery that had led me here, for the gift of this place and this life and this chance to grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.